Welcome. My name is Steve Call, and I'm the president of the New America Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's conference about the future of South Asia. Just a few scene-setting remarks from me and a couple of house notes. First, by way of thanks, this conference was organized and is a product of the work of the National Security Studies Group here at New America, which is led by Peter Bergen up here on the front table, and he collaborated here with Patrick Doherty and Brian Fishman in that group to put all of this together, and also Andrew Leibovich, who really put the day and last night's dinner together. So please take time to thank them as you go through the day, and they have my thanks as well. Also, Catherine Tiedemann back there, who is the brains behind the AFPAC channel, that I hope most of you subscribe to. If you don't, see her, and she will arrange that. And our partners at Foreign Policy, whose editor, Susan Klasser, is right below my elbow, also are the co-hosts of that channel. So thanks to them. Lots of collaborators in the room. Tried to ping all the networks that we work with to put this conference together, but I wanted to mention the Carr Center at Harvard as an important source of some of the talent that you'll hear from today. Just by way of scenes, and house notes first. We are on the record today. This is an invitation-only conference, but there is a live webcast for those who weren't invited. And we often have hundreds of people watching online, so please bear this in mind when the panels turn to your participation, and wait for the microphones and identify yourself and speak succinctly if you can. That would be very helpful. And if you have phones that make noise, this would be a good time to take account of that. Just a few sort of framing remarks about our objective today and what we were hoping to accomplish and introduce. This is going to be a very meaty, information-packed day, and probably not a lot of time to step back and try to set a theme for it. I'm not going to do too much of that, but I wanted to at least give you a sense of our purpose in framing the conference the way that we have. I think one of the things we hope to do, even though we're going to be dealing with a lot of frontline analysis and data about the insurgencies in Pakistan and Afghanistan, about the policy dilemmas facing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Obama administration, Afghans, the Pakistan government, and others over the course of the day, that we wanted to set this somewhat familiar conundrum into a broader context in two ways. Obviously, you can think about the regional context of the Afghan conflict in a reasonably traditional but very important way. We had a very rich discussion about it at dinner last night, the extent to which actors in the Afghan conflict are influenced by regional governments, the extent to which the conflict itself represents a proxy conflict among governments. This has been present in Afghanistan for a long time, certainly in the modern period since 1979, and to the extent that outsiders can correctly account for the regional forces at work in the war and perceptions at work in the war, to that extent they will have a chance to start to manage the transition that's intended over the next few years. And I think that will frame quite a lot of what we discuss. What is the role of the neighbors, Iran, China, Pakistan, the next layer of neighbors, Central Asia, India? How do those states see their interests in a post-NATO Afghanistan? How do they manage the pursuit of those interests? How do actors who are Afghans see themselves in relation to these regional governments? What does the act of being a proxy mean? There were some provocative comments about that last night at dinner, I thought. And how does it pinch the space in which Afghan actors in politics and the conflict perform their roles to be seen as proxies, to see themselves as proxies? So that's all very important. I'm sure that will dominate quite a lot of our discussion of the regional picture. But I wanted to introduce an even broader theme and to invite everybody who participates today, as they wish, to take it up from time to time, which is to say that I think it's time in Washington, at least as a South Asia traveler, to create space for other frameworks for thinking about the Afghan conflict and its context other than state competition and territorial competition of a traditional type. We're moving into a period of transformation in South Asia, and I wonder if Washington discourse accounts for all of the aspects of that transformation as it wrestles with problems like the Afghan conflict. This is a region where certainly the United States in its engagements going back to the end of the Second World War has continuously struggled with the tension between short-term security imperatives and the pursuit of long-term sustainability, whether it's through democratic politics or pluralistic politics or economic growth, middle-class formation. There's an intuitive understanding that those are the sources of self-sustaining success in South Asia, but there is a mechanism of government that requires constant response to short-term security crises, and the nature of those responses tends to postpone the pursuit of this self-sustaining region. And I think we're at a stage now, 9 years after 9/11, when there's a recognition, not only in some quarters of Washington, but in the region itself, that this cannot go on. It is imprisoning. So how do you start to think your way out of those boxes and out of those trade-offs to define some of the choices in a different way? And I think there are answers to that question that are available in the way we think about other regional dilemmas around the world and in the way we think about the changing nature of state competition. For example, it has been traditional in South Asia and in other settings like the Middle East to think about the way actors compete in conflicts through questions of territorial control, resource control, even in the economic sphere, zero-sum trade regime competitions, tariffs, and the like. Certainly that was the paradigm we inherited from the colonial period. We now take for granted in most parts of the world that the right way to think about state competition, while it certainly will include the list I just offered, must also include education, innovation, the ability to manage globalization, the ability to manage capital flows, hot capital flows, to be able to defend sovereignty that doesn't involve territorial borders or customs officers, but involves one's banking system or one's environment, one's access to basic resources like air and water that are now made available increasingly on a transnational basis. So when we try to add that way of thinking into our policy choices in regions like Southeast Asia or Latin America, we find these days, I think, in Washington, we're pretty far along in that discussion. Nobody would hold a conference about Latin America today without talking about what the transformational effects of middle-class formation and economic growth in Brazil are, how Mexico is changing as a result of the rising role of middle-income urbanites and so forth. And in South Asia, the objective fact is that India's economic growth has already created a context for such transformation, but we hardly ever talk about it. We talk about only the security dilemma and the state territorial competition that surrounds the security dilemma. And I just want to, even though we're going to do a lot of that today, and I welcome it, and I want it to be meaty and full of information, I want to introduce the invitation to occasionally anybody just pull back and try to set us, create space for this other kind of discourse. It's not an either or, but it is a form of layering. And I just sort of conclude by observing as a longtime Washington person that, and I'm sure many of you would endorse this, that in my experience of Washington and other capitals dominated by large governments, governments and militaries and the think tanks that work with them are often the last to see this kind of shift. That it really is something that comes outside of the momentum that policymaking and the duties, in many respects, that governments have draw them toward. So I do hope that we'll challenge our own assumptions about the balance of interests and the sources of conflict in the region over the course of the day. And with that, I would like to welcome my colleague Susan Glasser from Foreign Policy, who's going to run the first panel. We don't do a lot of breaks here. This is a nonstop flight, as we like to say. So between panels, people will just rotate, and we'll expect that you'll take care of yourselves as you're required. If you need anything that you don't have, just find Andrew or any of the other New America staff. Will be happy to help you. Susan.
Thanks so much, Steve, and thank you, Peter, for having me, and especially thank you, Steve, not only for being our partners, but also you're so good about plugging the AFPAC channel. I feel like I don't even need to. But for those of you who don't know, we do have a wonderful daily brief, so you can get all the news from Afghanistan and Pakistan, and you can sign up for it in email, and obviously we have lots of articles and individual pieces as well. So thank you for that. And, I was really struck in Steve's very sweeping and high-altitude introduction, as he is so good at doing. We're going to go right back down to earth, I think, in a lot of ways for this first panel and plunge sort of into the heart of the conversation about the insurgency in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and really do something which I think has been part of the vision of Peter and Steve with this program, which is really, in a way, to map and to understand in a much deeper way, what exactly it is that we're talking about. And I can't think of a better group than this group of people to really give us that kind of sort of textured and nuanced understanding that you don't often hear in these Washington conversations. It's true that they're dominated by security, but it's also true that they tend to be dominated by very broad brush security considerations, rather than people who've actually spent real time trying to understand in a different way and outside of the one or two sentences deep version of it. So I'm really excited to sort of hear what everybody has to say, and I think we'll just jump right in. Everybody's going to give sort of a quick opening presentation. We want to make sure to save time for your questions as well at the end. I'll just give a quick introduction for this group. Their bios are so impressive that you can look at them as well in your handouts. But right next to me is David Rohde from the New York Times. I'm sure most of you are familiar with his story, and for those of you who aren't, I guess his book will be coming out. When is it coming out?
November 30th.
Very soon. Okay, so his book will be coming out very soon. A Rope and a Prayer, which should give you more context on his kidnapping by the Taliban in November of 2008 and his very dramatic escape on the night of June 19th, 2009. David is a two-time Pulitzer winner, both as part of a Times reporting team for covering the region, and before that, when he worked at the Christian Science Monitor and covered the Srebrenica massacre. He has a lot of experience in the region and was named, in fact, to head the South Asia Bureau as far back as 2002 at the time. So he has long context in addition to his very recent, very detailed knowledge of what's happening there. After that, we'll hear from Anand Gopal, who has reported from Afghanistan for the past 3 years. He's worked also as a correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor, the Wall Street Journal, and other outlets, and has recently written an absolute must-read paper for New America on the insurgency in Kandahar. I was told by a very knowledgeable source this is the single best thing he's ever seen written on that part of the country, so I recommend it to you all. And Anand is also working on his own book about Afghanistan. When does that come out, Anand?
Don't ask.
Okay, forthcoming, I believe, is the phrase for that. Michael Waltz has been a key both civilian policy advisor and in the Special Forces Reserves. He also served as Vice President Cheney's Special Advisor for South Asia and counterterrorism. I believe we were last here together, in fact, at a memorable panel conversation about some of your experience in the region. He also represented the Office of the Vice President during President Bush's strategic review of U.S. policy toward Afghanistan and Pakistan. And before that, he was also the country director for Afghanistan in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So he brings a really intimate understanding of both the internal policy discussions as well as some of that invaluable ground truth, and there is indeed at times a big gap between those two things. Philip Mudd is a New America Senior Research Fellow in the National Security Studies Program. He joined the FBI in 2005 as the Deputy Assistant Director of the Bureau's National Security Branch, and oversees counterterrorism, counterintelligence, intelligence programs. Before that, he spent 2 decades at the CIA, primarily in the Counterterrorism Center, where he was the Executive Assistant Director for Counterterrorism and Counterintelligence. He also served as the Director responsible for the Gulf and Middle Eastern issues at the National Security Council, and as the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Near East and South Asia at the National Intelligence Council. So we'll leave the most informed for last. With no further ado, I want to open it up by starting with David. And, I can't think of someone better to give us a real sense of the insurgency and what it looks like up close.
Thank you very much. It's a thrill to be here and to be on this panel. And I want to first actually plug what Steve was saying, in that my experience in the region was actually at first from 2002 to 2005 being based in Delhi. And I had this unusual perspective of flying repeatedly from Delhi to Islamabad to Kabul to Dubai. And I saw those economic forces Steve was talking about, the growing middle class in all those countries, and the sort of tremendous energy of the region in the sense that it was taking off, and a very strong sense among young people in all those countries that this was sort of the moment for their country and the moment for the region, and India was leading the way, and Dubai in another sense, but that they were going to be left behind, and that they, Pakistani said they didn't want to be some sort of backward banana republic, and, there was a real optimism there. Young Afghans felt the same way. And what unfolded, and I was also one of the journalists. I first arrived in Afghanistan in 2001. I'm not an old hand, but I was really optimistic about what could be achieved, and was there in Kabul in the fall of 2001 when the Taliban fell. And I think that what's unfolded since then is tragic, but we shouldn't fall into the box of thinking the region is impossible. I do think there are ways forward. I do think there are transformational things, particularly economically, that are happening that give cause for optimism. I spent a lot of my time in Helmand province. I was actually working on a book about Helmand, looking at the U.S. effort in Helmand during the Cold War. As many of you know, there was a massive U.S. aid project there that there was an enormous dam built, hundreds of miles of irrigation canals, and Lashkar-Gah, the provincial capital, was actually called Little America. And my book was about what had gone wrong in this sort of second effort to create an American-backed renaissance in Helmand. I had one U.S. aid official, in terms of the frustrations he felt working on the ground, say to me that we could put men on the moon and we're the leaders of the Western world, but we couldn't build schools. And he talked about how, and I think this is, it's Afghans, but I think people across the region, that the failure of the small, I think it's fair to say, U.S. effort from sort of 2001 to 2008, he said it put doubts in the minds of people about how effective we were in terms of security or stopping the Taliban. And I found that in my last trip there in October and November 2008, that most of the population in Helmand seemed to be supporting the Taliban. And that led me to make a decision to interview a Taliban commander, and led to my time in captivity. One thing I have to point out is I have to leave early today, and it relates indirectly to my pursuit of this interview. 2 months before I was kidnapped, I got married, and I was very lucky that my wife, Kristen, was so supportive and strong for me, and as was her family. About 6 months ago, I agreed to give a talk this afternoon in Boston at the request of my father-in-law. And given what I put his daughter through 2 months into our marriage, I'm sticking by that commitment, so I'll be slipping out early, but that's why. And I apologize for having to leave early, but I'm trying to do both events today. I first want to say that my time in the tribal areas was very stark. What I'm going to say now is very pessimistic, but I want to be honest with you about what I saw there and what I experienced. But please keep in mind the broader trends and the hope about what could happen and how the region could be transformed. I I was kidnapped with two Afghan colleagues. We were just an hour outside of Kabul. We were in Logar province. We were moved across the Afghan countryside very easily over the next few days. I never saw any American or Afghan forces. There seemed to be an enormous vacuum in the countryside. We were moved from Logar, I'm not sure through which provinces, but we walked over the mountains from Paktika into South Waziristan. And when we entered South Waziristan, all Pakistani government posts had been abandoned, and instead they were manned by the Taliban. And one major point I noticed, and this would continue, we were held both in North and South Waziristan, and I saw seamless cooperation during our 7 months in captivity between the Haqqani network and the Pakistani Taliban at that point, led by Tullah Masood. And I can talk about this more if you want, but I was also able to watch drone strikes, saw them up close, saw how the Taliban reacted to them, and can talk about them as well. One positive thing I saw in the tribal areas was that Pashtunwali remains a very strong force. I was actually a beneficiary of that. I was never beaten by my captors, which I think had a great deal to do with Pashtunwali. I was given bottled water to keep me healthy, and I even got regular copies of Dawn, the Pakistani newspaper. So I endured. I had much better treatment than many people expected. What makes me less optimistic, in a sense, was that my family's and my wife's experience negotiating with the Haqqanis. Yes, there's lots of talk in the air of negotiations with the Taliban. And look, this is obviously a kidnapping. Michael Semple, who's a speaker here later today, helped me sort of coin a phrase describing the Haqqanis as a criminal organization masquerading as a pious religious movement. So the negotiations did not go well with the Haqqanis. Again, the Haqqanis do not represent all the Taliban, but I have to be honest with you. It was extraordinarily confusing. There were multiple channels. It was unclear who was actually speaking for the Haqqanis or who even held us. What did become clear over time was that the Taliban's expectations were enormous. Their initial demands for our release were $25 million and 15 prisoners. When we escaped 7 months later, what looked like the clearest demand stood at $7 million and 4 prisoners. There was one other channel saying that things could be solved maybe for a smaller amount, but it was unclear whether that would actually happen. And what was even more depressing was sort of the views of the Taliban commanders that I spent my 7 months with and talking to them. The Haqqanis were enormously confident about their pending victory in Afghanistan. They, as you've heard many times, joked about the Soviets taking 10 years in Afghanistan, and they believed the United States at that point would soon reach 10 years itself and withdraw in frustration. They essentially lived in an alternate reality. And the same regional dynamic that we're talking about, I saw that among my Haqqani guards, but it wasn't a positive one. They saw the Taliban as the victims of a sort of vast alliance of Christians, Jews, and Hindus. They saw this as a religious war against Islam. India was seen as an enemy. One of my guards was told by a Haqqani commander to go kidnap an Indian engineer. Given the regional context, I thought that was significant. And they saw themselves as part of a broader conflict against Islam. I was in captivity during the Israeli attacks on Gaza. They were infuriated by them. They cheered any attacks in Iraq on American forces. And near the end of our captivity, protests had begun in Iran in the wake of the elections there. Again, all the protests were seen as staged by the CIA and an effort to weaken Muslims and enslave Muslims. They were absolutely convinced that American troops were forcing Afghans to convert to Christianity, and they also believed that Afghan women were being forced to work as prostitutes on U.S. military bases. I lived with one young Pakistani who was being trained to work to become a suicide bomber. He essentially dismissed all Westerners as weak hedonists that were only interested in earthly pleasures. And one of their main thoughts was that Americans and Westerners fear death a tremendous amount, and if they could kill enough Westerners, we'd quickly give up on our efforts. He believed that all Christians want to live for 1,000 years. He had been told that American soldiers hunted this rare animal and would capture it in the countrysides of Afghanistan and then serve it to their officers. That animal was a pig. As you know, eating pork is haram. He believed that a necktie was a secret symbol of Christianity, and that for any true Muslim, this world was a burden. He didn't view anybody living in Kabul or Islamabad as a Muslim. My guards cheered bomb attacks in mosques that killed peoples they worshipped. and all of them were basically very poorly educated. One of them had a high school education. The other one had another two maybe had a junior high education, and one of them had been given a book, again describing arriving in paradise and 70 virgins waiting for him, and he read it like a fifth grader. He would sort of sound out every word. When a gunman shot 13 people in an immigration office in upstate New York in the spring of 2009, Baitullah Massoud announced that he had carried out the attack, that he had infiltrated someone in the United States. Later on in the day, there was a radio broadcast that said that the gunman was actually a Vietnamese American. My Haqqani network guards were puzzled, and they asked me if Vietnamese people were Muslims. When the American sea captain was kidnapped off the coast of Somalia, and then the three pirates were shot by American snipers, again, my Haqqani network guards dismissed that story. They believe that the United States had secretly paid a $25 million ransom, and that's how the captain was freed. Swine flu was seen as God's retribution against people who eat pork. And what was extraordinary was that at the same time, my guards were very technologically savvy. They, did not live in caves. I, early on in the kidnapping, made a mistake and spoke about my reporting in Bosnia, and thought that told them that I had helped write stories and helped expose the execution of roughly 8,000 Muslims in Bosnia. Their response to that was that simply meant I was worth more money. I was smart enough to never mention the name Richard Holbrooke to them, but come January 2009, they were Googling me, and they saw that Richard Holbrooke had helped pressure the Serbs into releasing me from a much briefer captivity in Bosnia. They declared I was Richard Holbrooke's best friend. They told me that President Barack Obama visited Saudi Arabia in the spring of 2009 simply to discuss my case and do nothing else. And they even found my brother Lee. As you can see, I have an unusual spelling of my last name. My brother is a Air Force veteran who runs his own small aviation consulting company. On his website, it says he's president of that firm. The firm consists of 4 full-time employees, but my captors decided that my brother was the head of a firm that manufactures jumbo jets, and they told him that if he would simply sell one jumbo jet, enough money could be raised for a ransom. Lastly, they spoke of Osama bin Laden with reverence, calling him Sheikh Osama, and they spoke of a prophecy of black flags, an army emerging from Khorasan carrying black flags that would liberate the 2 holy cities of Saudi Arabia from an apostate regime. And what I saw over time was that the tribal areas acted as a fulcrum where young Afghan and Pakistani Taliban spent time with foreign militants and were sort of immersed in Al-Qaeda's view of establishing a hardline emirate that spans the Islamic world. Again, I can talk more about drone strikes, but I'm going to keep this short and let the other panelists speak. But the reality was that the drone strikes, what I saw, created sort of a stalemate. Yes, they were generally accurate. There were civilians killed, but not the numbers the Taliban claim. But while the leadership was being taken out, the Taliban were able to generate new leaders by exaggerating the extent of the drone strikes. And until the Pakistani army moves into North Waziristan, there'll be no resolution of the situation. This stalemate that exists will continue, and drone strikes in and of themselves are not enough to stabilize the situation. I do hope that negotiations can succeed in the region. I'm eager for this tragedy to end. Far too many Afghans, Pakistanis, and Americans have died. And I hope, as many people talk about, that the ISI can deliver the Haqqanis as their proxies, potentially in some sort of political agreement. But I fear that the ISI is overconfident about its ability to deliver the Haqqanis. They were overconfident about their ability to handle the Pakistani Taliban, and the same may be true of the Pakistanis themselves. From what I could see, the Haqqanis are very clever, and what they're doing is sort of playing all sides and telling each side what they want to hear. They tell the local Arabs that they're sheltering. I assume that they will continue protecting them. They may be simultaneously telling the ISI they will obey the ISI. And meanwhile, they're strengthening themselves. They've got multiple sources of revenue, support coming in from the Gulf, timber revenues from inside Afghanistan, and potentially revenues coming in from Pakistan. One positive thing was that I saw deep divisions within the Taliban. As far as we could tell, it's not clear, but the Haqqanis cut the Quetta Shura out of the negotiations for my case. We were told that the Quetta Shura actually asked and was curious about, whether the Haqqanis had me, and this was all in essence about who gets what share of ransom money that they hope would be paid. And after our escape, I've heard there was tremendous tension and blame among the different commanders who had us, each blaming the other for our escape, each being very suspicious of the other. No ransom was paid. We did escape, but the different Haqqani factions blamed each other, thinking that one faction had somehow taken money and helped us escape and not given any of the funds to the other one. Recently, I've heard, and this will come out in an article soon, but from another journalist, he has heard from a fairly reliable source that the Haqqanis were so angry after our escape that they handed over 2 of our guards to the ISI, and the ISI held them for several months and tortured them. The ISI's, and this would be the sort of shadowy wing of the ISI, as the source put it. There's one wing of the ISI that's working with the Americans and another that's working with the Taliban. This was the wing of the ISI that's working with the Taliban, and they the questioning to the guards was not how did this happen, why did this kidnapping occur. It was why did you let them escape, and in essence, why did the Haqqanis not get this money that they were expecting. Instead of handing over our guards to other Pakistani officials or to American officials, my 2 guards were released by the ISI. Again, I'm hopeful that there can be progress in the region. I don't think the operations of one wing of the ISI should cloud an incredibly diverse and a region that has positive dynamics continuing in it. But I also want to be honest with you about what I saw on the ground in Waziristan. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. Anand, I'm looking forward to hearing from you about Kandahar.
Thank you. Keeping with talking about rethinking frameworks and narratives, I wanted to summarize a little bit from my latest paper from New America Foundation about Kandahar and the insurgency in Kandahar province. It's actually a very long paper, I think 20,000 words, so you should print it out and take it to the beach or something and spend an afternoon on it. Particularly, I think some elements of it, in particular, looking at how the Taliban were able to reorganize themselves in the years after 2001, can in part inform discourse today about negotiations and reconciliation. So I'd like to focus on that. Start in December 2001, when most of the country was falling to the Northern Alliance or other U.S.-backed forces. And at that point, in Kandahar city, which at that point Kandahar was still one of the last remaining holdouts of the Taliban. In Kandahar city, there was a secret meeting between the senior leadership of the Taliban, mostly the military side, Mullah Omar, the defense minister, frontline commanders, and so on and so forth. And there was a debate there. And the debate was what to do in terms of the very imminent collapse of the Islamic Emirate. Some people thought that the best course of action was to stand and fight to the very last, to the end, and that was Mullah Omar's position initially. Others thought that the best course of action was to drop everything and flee to Pakistan and to allow the incoming forces to simply take everything over. But the majority in that meeting felt that the best course of action was to surrender to the new Afghan government. Now, this is just after the Bonn conference, to surrender to them, to hand over the weapons, and to ask for amnesty in the coming years. So the debate ensued for some hours, and ultimately the majority, which was in favor of surrendering, convinced the minority. Mullah Omar drafted a letter asking or announcing that the Taliban leadership had surrendered, recognizing the authority of the new government, and detailing which commanders, typically they were neutral commanders, which commanders that they were going to turn over their weapons, their vehicles, and so on and so forth. And then Mullah Omar sent emissaries to meet Hamid Karzai. Karzai at that point was coming into Kandahar city to liberate it, and he was at that point north of Kandahar city. So he sent the defense minister and some other representatives, and they met Karzai in a secret meeting in December, in which they handed over the letter and they described the terms of their surrender. Mullah Omar escaped into Pakistan, but the majority of the senior leadership at that point, particularly those who had hailed originally from Kandahar, had gone individually again after that and surrendered their weapons, their vehicles. The men under them had also surrendered and had returned to their home villages in Kandahar. Just to give you an example of some of these figures, one was the defense minister at the time, Mullah Ubaidullah, who clearly was a very high-ranking official. Another one was Mullah Brother, who at that time was a deputy defense minister, and he was also a frontline commander involved in the fight against the Northern Alliance. Another was Mullah Akhtar Mansour. He was the civil aviation minister at the time, and in subsequent years would prove to be a very important figure in the Taliban insurgency. Another was Tayyib Agha, who was an on-and-off spokesman of Mullah Omar, and he was also a close advisor to Mullah Omar. And there are many, many others that I won't mention, but it's in the paper also. All of them had individually surrendered to Afghan government forces, to the Northern Alliance, or to other forces, and returned to their home village. They were promised amnesty at that point. Mullah Akhtar Mansour, for instance, had returned to his home village in Maiwand district of Kandahar. And as they were doing that, hundreds of commanders under them, the people that they had directed in the previous 5 or 6 years, were doing the same thing. They were handing over their weapons and vehicles to Afghan government forces in return for what they hoped would be amnesty. Now, despite that, over the next 3 or 4 years, and we're talking 2001 to 2004, Afghan government forces systematically targeted these former Taliban officials. And in Kandahar province particularly, this was the governor Gulaga Shirzai, and he had a network of commanders under him who were doing this, Jed Gulalai, Aga Shah, and so on and so forth. But in every province in the south, this happened in Uruzgan, this happened in Helmand, it's happened in Zabul. What we saw was Afghan government forces going after former Taliban who had surrendered to the government. Their motivations were varied in doing this. The main motivation was money. What they could do was they could arrest former Taliban and extort money from them through torture and detention. Also, many of them had scores to settle. The Taliban, of course, treated people poorly in their government, and so this is their chance, some of these commanders' chance to get back at the Taliban. Whatever the reason may be, this happened across the board in southern Afghanistan, particularly in Kandahar. And I'll give you one example, which I detail in the paper. Is a man named Mullah Ahmed Shah. And Ahmed Shah was a mid-level commander. He wasn't terribly important in the Taliban regime. He's from Mushan, which is a village in Panjwai district in western Kandahar. And he was arrested 3 times by the forces of Gulaga Shirzai. Each time he was detained and abused and tortured. Each time his family had to raise funds for him to be released, essentially a bribe to get him to be released. After the 3rd time in which he was released, he fled to Pakistan and he rejoined the Taliban. Today, Mullah Ahmed Shah is one of the most important commanders in Mushan village. He's the head of the Taliban court, the shadow court that exists there. And like him, there's many, many, many others like that. If you go to southern Afghanistan and talk to Taliban commanders, which I've done over the course of 3 years, this is a story that gets repeated again and again about former regime members being systematically targeted despite the fact that they have surrendered. So by 2003, much of the senior leadership of the Taliban had come to the position, or come to the understanding that there was no place for them in the post-2001 state of affairs. And so they went back to Pakistan, or they fled to Pakistan, and they began to organize an insurgency there. In 2003 was the founding of a leadership council in Quetta, which we now call the Quetta Shura. And as they were doing this, they began to resuscitate the networks of commanders that they had across the country, particularly in the south. These are networks that have gone back for 30 years. They've been forged through 30 years of warfare. They're based either on friendships with people they've had on the front lines, or kinship ties, tribal ties, whatever it may be. they began to resuscitate these networks. They would reach out to these people. One of the guys who was very instrumental in doing this was Mullah Obedullah, the former defense minister, who had actually surrendered in the initial months after 2001. But like others, he had fled to Pakistan and reached out to some of his former sub-commanders, the people he knew, and kinsmen and tribesmen. What he found, as I spoke to him, what he found in reaching out to these people was that many of them, mid-level and low-level commanders, were facing similar circumstances where they were the target of government abuse and government reprisals. And so in that way, very quickly, 2003, 2004, these old networks began to be reactivated. As they were being reactivated on a leadership level, these people, these former leaders in Quetta, also very keenly were able to exploit the grievances that were latent in Afghan society at the time, in the South particularly. These grievances include tribal imbalances, for instance, where a particular tribe is seen to be favored over another tribe, or a particular tribe is seen to be represented in the government over other tribes. This was the case in Kandahar, in Uruzgan, and in Helmand particularly. In addition, they were able to exploit resentment against what was perceived as very poor governance. The police were seen as being very corrupt, very predatory. The justice system, and justice is something that's incredibly important in rural Afghan society, in which it's fraught with international conflicts, it's fraught with tribal conflicts, clan conflicts, etc. The justice system of the Afghan government was seen to be extremely lacking and very biased and faulty. There was also either real or perceived abuses of the foreign forces, in which the Taliban were able to use as a recruitment tool to bring people into their fold. So this existed in southern Afghanistan across the board. In Kandahar province, as I mentioned, Gulaga Sherzai and his network of commanders were responsible. In Uruzgan, John Muhammad Khan, who is the governor of Uruzgan province, he had a network of commanders as well, who were largely behind this sort of activity. In Helmand province, Sher Mohammad Akhundzada and other smaller commanders who are involved in this. In Zabul province, Mr. Hamidullah Tokhe, who is also the governor at the time. And so what began to happen is that large numbers of people would join the Taliban. 2005 and 2006 would join the Taliban, would connect with people that they had perhaps worked with in the 90s, or perhaps just been related to or had shared some sort of common network with, either tribally or otherwise. To the point where by 2007, most of the rural parts of Kandahar were either under Taliban control outright, or faced significant Taliban influence, leaving just the urban areas and a few other districts aside. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in today. And I think, I bring this up because it's vitally important to understand, if we're going to talk about the idea of reconciliation and negotiations is in the air today. To talk about, or to begin to wrap our heads around those concepts, we need to try to understand why the Taliban fight, what's their motivation for fighting. In southern Afghanistan, what I laid out, I think, is a large part of what are the motivations for the Taliban to be fighting, and I think that will hopefully, if we pay attention to this, should inform us moving forward.
Anand, thanks so much. Michael?
Thank you. As Susan mentioned, I know, Susan, I promised to try to keep this quick. I would leave time for some questions. Yeah. As Susan mentioned, I've kind of had two hats in the policy world and then in the operational world. From the operational side, I returned in March of this year, where I have responsibility for the Special Forces teams basically across from North and South Waziristan. And so what I think I'll do today is just tell you a quick anecdote of some of the tribal dynamics from my own personal experience, and then pull some policy threads from that. So two of the tribes that we were working closely with in host province were both the Makbil tribe and the Mengal tribe. The Mengal, just very quickly, are one of the largest tribes in Loya Paktika, which is Paktia, Paktika, and Host, and to some degree a little bit of Ghazni. They've traditionally supported a series of Afghan monarchies. They provide, still today, recruits to the Afghan National Security Forces, civil servants to local government, and they're a pretty, for eastern Afghanistan anyway, a pretty homogenous tribal entity. By contrast, the Makbil are a minority tribe. They're a sub-tribe of the Zahadran. Not to get into too many names, but the Zahadran are important because that's where the Haqqani family hails from. And what you find in eastern Afghanistan is 80% of the time, I would say, the minority tribes tend to support the insurgency, often because they're historically disenfranchised. That's an important distinction from the South, in my experience, where I was in Kandahar and Uruzgan in 2005 and 2006, where the minority tribes tended to be the ruling, kind of the part of the ruling coalitions. So the heart of the dispute between the Mengal and the Makbil were pine nuts, and the pine nut trade, and particularly the cross-border trade. And what had happened was the Mengal had moved into some Makbil areas and taken essentially some of their what they believed was their lands. The Makbil had other designs. Long story short, the Haqqanis, through some of their emissaries and through some of their commanders, began providing heavy weapons to the minority Makbil tribe. So as the fighting ebbed back and forth, there was a particular evening when the Mengal kind of moved into some Makbil areas and really faced a firestorm. And folks, we're not talking a few pot shots. We're talking mortars, heavy machine guns. It was really, really quite an event, and with probably several dozen dead on both sides, and the Mengal were really stymied by it. And what the Haqqanis then very cleverly did, fast forwarding again, was sent a peace, kind of a peace jirga, or a series of peace emissaries, to do what the local government and frankly what the coalition had not been able to do. So they escalated the fighting, and then came in as a legitimate dispute resolution force. And out of that, the Mengal ended up cutting a deal with the Haqqani family to allow some of their very substantial lands up in the mountains to the northwest of Khost to be used for training camps. And as we watched this kind of situation degenerate, and we saw the Haqqanis establishing themselves, I personally was very alarmed, and so were the other commanders. The Haqqanis made a critical mistake, though. They began denying the Mengal their access to the pine nuts and to their livelihoods. And we began working with the Mengal, establishing a relationship. As an aside, I pushed very strongly for local security initiatives in the Bush Strategic Review, left the White House in January 2009, now found myself in 2009 actually trying to stand up some of those programs, which were then called the Community Defense Initiative. And I was very interested in the Mengal and their kind of historical outreach, and they were now reaching out to us to help them with their problems with the Haqqanis. We established a relationship. Oh, by the way, the Mengal, by various estimates, could stand up about 1,500 what they called Arbakai, which were a tribal police force. It's called Chawasti in other areas, but in the east, particularly, they're called Arbakai. And I was very interested in having them working with us, or at least not working against us. Fast forwarding, again, standing in my headquarters, watching the president's December speech, particularly with the allusion to July 11, our next kind of final meeting with the Mengal was really very difficult. The particular elder that I established a very strong relationship with had brought in many of the sub-tribes, and essentially in their own Afghan way said, look, we've always suspected that you would leave us. Now your government has said that you will leave us. How can we possibly risk our families' lives to do this and to work with you? And essentially the effort kind of stalled since then, and I'm not sure where it is fast forwarding today. So an interesting side bit, what moved the relationship farthest forward was actually a direct action kind of a kill-capture raid against the Haqqanis. As we began working with the Bengal and their frustration over these training camps, kind of squatting on their tribal lands where they couldn't get timber and they couldn't get their pine nuts, we ended up finally nailing down where some of these locations were. They're very difficult to find. Took direct action, killed 36 of the Haqqanis fighters, and it was really amazing. We literally had a procession of elders coming out of the mountains, thanking us, very appreciative that we finally took action. They had been begging us to do this for quite some time. We had taken it, and I think it's just a great side story of how direct action in that part of the world and taking strong action can have positive benefits, unlike how it's often portrayed. So we had the December speech. The effort kind of stalled since then, with a lack of confidence that we would stay. And I think, what are some of the policy threads from that story? In my experience, the majority of the Afghans do indeed want us there. They do see, or they certainly don't see, the insurgency as the way forward for their country. But that said, the Afghans are survivalists. They're making life and death decisions every day. Those elders sitting down with us on that final meeting, 2 have since been assassinated, and that meeting room was bombed. It's easy to talk about engaging with the insurgency, but engaging with the populace, but unless there is a confidence there that will remain and provide a modicum of security, that's very difficult to carry through. I'll leave you with a few things. That particular elder, you get to a point where you have kind of the Afghan to Westerner conversations, and eventually you get to the point where you can truly have some meaningful discussions. And one evening he said to me, "Look, you can provide all of the schools you want, all of the roads you want, all of the projects you want. We truly deeply appreciate it, and our people need them. But at the end of the day, when there's a gun to my family's head tonight, what do you expect me to do, and what do you expect my people to do?" So I think, as we in the military, frankly, I think often, but again, I am here speaking in my civilian capacity, but folks in the military often, I think, feel very enlightened, saying that it's not just security, we must have economic development, we must have governance, and all of that is true. But at the end of the day, when as I saw, a girls' school gets machine gunned, NSP monies, one of the most effective national security or national solidarity program monies, are repeatedly stolen from the development councils to fund the insurgency, when elders who accept humanitarian aid are literally beheaded and their bodies are burned on top of the pile of the humanitarian aid in front of the village. We will not have those other Ds without a modicum and a monopoly of security. I just don't see how it can happen. So to take a step back and try to answer Steve's dilemma of short-term security and longer-term gains, I think we get out of the box, so to speak, and out of that dilemma by stopping the kind of this incremental approach to resourcing the effort in Afghanistan. We've seen the situation get worse, and we pour a little more in. We see it get worse again the next year, which is, again, the most violent year, and we pour a little bit in. And I would argue, and be happy to answer your questions, that we have to get ahead of that. We have to devote the resources in the short term so that we have the ability for the other Ds to develop in the long term. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Phil.
We're doing fine. Any questions? Is that short enough?
You got it all figured out, right?
It's one.
I remember going to Bonn as the CIA referent to Ambassador Dobbin's team in, I don't even remember when it was, November or December of 2001, and then going to Karzai's inauguration. And I was sitting in Bonn. We were staying at a hotel down at the base of the mountain, and we go up the hill to this castle sort of fortress. And I get a request from an Afghan warlord. I don't know if I've ever told this story publicly, but it sort of captures my views in a nutshell, to see him privately. My translator was the lowly paid Zal Khalilzad, who became and I still bug Zal about that, telling him that his job is really my translator. I don't care about that UN perm rep thing. And this warlord says, "I hear you're the CIA guy here." And if you give me more AK-47s, I can take care of business for you. And I'm thinking 9 years later, you know, we're working in a country that we went into because we faced a threat from people who were given safe haven. We didn't face a threat from the Taliban. We faced a threat from Al-Qaeda. At a peace conference in Bonn, Germany, where after 9/11 you have a warlord in the middle of the conference saying more weapons is better weapons. And here we are 9 years later in having a conversation about subduing or somehow pacifying a country with a Taliban presence that, in my view, was never the reason we got in the first place. And furthermore, the Brits failed, the Pakistanis failed, the Afghans themselves failed, the Soviets failed. So I think one of the questions, to get to Steve's point, has to be, do we want to talk about pacifying a country, or do we want to talk about American security in narrower terms and accepting what I believe is inevitable, which is the Taliban return in the country? So let me switch for a moment to Al-Qaeda and just talk for a couple moments about how to think about Al-Qaeda. In the midst of all this, in the midst of warlords who want AK-47s at peace conferences, I'll never forget that. I feel like I should write a story at some point. Truth is stranger than fiction. When we went in, and when we sat at the threat briefing table in 2002 and beyond, when I was back at CIA, there were so many unknowns. In all the categories that any organization has: training, recruitment, fundraising, safe haven, leadership. We struggled to understand the adversary we were facing, and we'd spend Friday nights saying, I wonder if this is going to be a horrible weekend, because they all were. You know, is something going to happen tomorrow? And if you look at the ability of the Al-Qaeda organization to operate, I think there has been a lot of progress in the past 9 years. Progress in all those categories that I regard as secondary, things like fundraising, but significant progress in the two areas I think are most significant, and that is leadership and safe haven, which are interlinked. Safe haven gives leadership the ability to conduct attacks. So we have leadership that's been decimated. I don't think that can be replaced. I would agree Pakistani Taliban can replace leadership after a drone strike. I don't believe that the leadership represented by Abu Faraj al-Libi, Hamza Rabia, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed can ever be replaced. And I think one of the measures over time that I would watch is a consistency of operations to ensure that can't happen. The same holds true for safe haven. I think, and I'm going to take a guess here, that negotiations with the Taliban are good for us long-term security-wise, because I don't think, and I'm talking about Afghan Taliban, not Pakistani Taliban, I think they learned their lesson. And I think if our measure of security success in Afghanistan is the return of people who have the safe haven to operate an organization that can threaten Twin Towers, I think the likelihood that the Afghan Taliban says this is a good idea is pretty low. So again, if we measure our security concerns in terms of worrying about people who can threaten U.S. shores, I think we're not in a bad position, both in terms of pressure on the safe haven and leadership of the organization, and on the likelihood that if Taliban returns in Afghanistan, these guys, namely the Uzbeks, the Chechens, the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Yemenis, will have substantial opportunities to build safe haven. My key question would be, how do we maintain a capability in that new regime in Afghanistan that allows us to strike point targets if we get information that suggests that people threatening us are returning? One last variable before I switch to go a little more global and close, and that is, somebody mentioned North Waziristan, which I think is the key last sort of item on the agenda in Pakistan. If you think of intelligence capabilities are directed against point targets, not against geographic space. So you have intelligence services looking at the leadership of Al-Qaeda, but not able to control North or South Waziristan. That is, especially in an area where coalition forces can't go, that is the problem of Pakistani security services. And as long as northern Waziristan stays as it is, you have the potential for safe haven with a group that's married in, bought in for 9 or 10 years now. I think, by the way, one of the interesting questions over time will be the Pakistanis, who still, I think, see South Asia in Indo-Pakistani terms. I think one of the remarkable changes, even in the past 9 years, has been India is globalized, Pakistan is not. So you look at President Obama going, and I think rightly talking to the Indians about the Security Council, I've got to believe my friends in Pakistan are saying, geez, I'm nervous again. They sold us out on nuclear stuff. They sold us out on Kashmir. They're squeezing us to go to North Waziristan, and they're getting closer and closer to those damn Indians. I'm thinking that we can pressure them as much as we want, but they own the home turf. They are the homeboys, and they're going to be very nervous as they seek assurances from us that we will be there long term. So I think we're doing okay. In short, I think the Taliban negotiations in Afghanistan are a good thing for American security. And I think that we face a long-term question still about closing out that safe haven problem with the Pakistani government that's going to be very suspicious of us, and probably rightly so. Let me close with a couple thoughts on one key distinction as we go down the road, and that is the distinction we don't talk about much. It's very nuanced for the American people between Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaedism. If you look at what's happened to bin Laden and Zawahiri, nobody pays attention to Jazeera anymore, and I think it's hard for them to get airtime. And when they do get airtime, if you look at what they've said about Europe recently, for example, very defensive organization, less talking about what the positive message is of Al-Qaeda and more pissed off people who want revenge. They see veils and they say, let's go get them. That's not right. It's an organization that is premised on sparking a global revolution, Al-Qaedaism, if you will, and is losing ground in its ability to spark that revolution because they're seen as increasingly irrelevant, increasingly murderous people who murdered locals in Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, etc., and without a positive message. So if Al-Qaedaism is to take hold, especially with the declining leadership in Pakistan, I'd close by saying, where's it going to take hold? The places one would have thought years ago, North Africa, the Horn of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, Southeast Asia, fraught with problems. One of the biggest surprises I've seen is the failure of Al-Qaeda, the Islamic Maghreb. This is a bunch of murderous criminals who are inside the movement seen as taking hostages for money. This is not with the capability, given the Moroccan and Algerian presence in Europe, to pose maybe the biggest threat to U.S. shores, and I just don't see them getting much traction in the Sahel and elsewhere. It was very interesting to me to see the Algerians again returning the 90s model and saying, let's give weapons to villagers, because they know the villagers aren't too keen on these guys either. Very difficult for an insurgency to operate when the government feels comfortable enough to say, we'll give villagers weapons because the villagers don't want to see the insurgents or terrorists come back. You go into Somalia, I also don't see that as a great potential for Al-Qaedaism. Let's be blunt. That's not seen by global jihadists as a place to go. Not like Afghanistan, not like Chechnya, not like Kashmir. That's an African place to go and a place to go for kids from Minneapolis and London. It is not, to my mind, potentially, I'm being a little more black and white because we don't have much time here, but not potentially, I think, an engine for global jihad. Let's go to close the last two places. That is Arabian Peninsula and Southeast Asia. I don't think that Al-Qaeda, the Arabian Peninsula, is going to get there in time. I don't think they have potential of doing what happened in Pakistan. I think one of the reasons they grew is because Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia made a mistake. They were fueled by Saudis coming down and supporting Al-Qaeda, the Arabian Peninsula. And in essence, this is a child of Saudi successes. They have to form in Sana'a because they can't form in Riyadh. And I don't think Sana'a over the long term, and I'm talking about the course of years, is going to be able to provide the structure in terms of safe haven training, fundraising, to stage a global movement toward Al-Qaedaism in the way that we should have feared and did fear in 01, 02, 03, 04, 05. Lastly, a place that doesn't get enough attention, and that is Southeast Asia, and particularly Indonesia. My friends in the business often talk to me about, 9 years into this, a lot of the people we took down are getting out again. First on that list is Abu Bakr Bashir in the largest Islamic country in the world, in a place that has more history for radical Islamic thought than many of the other places we're talking about. I long-term worry about Indonesia. I worry about the government will to pursue the target. I worry about the resonance of the Al-Qaeda-ist, if you will, the local Al-Qaeda-ist message in Indonesia. But put it in the broader context, I think that's a concern, but compared to the concerns we had 02, 03, 04, 05, I think we're doing okay. But not if we think of security in terms of keeping weapons away from people who fought each other since the beginning of time and people that weren't the initial spark for us to enter their country. That's it. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Phil. I think that's a perfect point to pick up with some of our questions. I'll one sec, start with questions. First, I just want to jump in and ask our panelists. Phil talked about a lot of things actually that didn't come up in the rest of the panel, so I wanted to quickly sort of go through on 2 points in particular. One, you mentioned President Obama's trip to India right now. That's a subtext, if not a text, of a lot of the conversation about security in the region. I'm curious what the other panelists think about the India factor in Pakistan and Afghanistan as well. How much, you mentioned, targeting an attack against an Indian engineer, for example, amongst the folks that you were with. How much do you feel as though that India factor is driving and is a key part that keeps fueling the insurgency to the other folks? And then the other question related to that is the Al-Qaeda question. Again, it's not something that most of the rest of you brought up in talking about, sort of painting the picture of the insurgents. You, for the most part, sketched a real picture of local factors, of the Pine Nut War, of tribal issues, of some of the mistakes of the Karzai government in terms of, turning people who might have been incorporated into the government 9 years ago and turning them right back against it. Those are much more granular, and they have to do with Afghanistan, they have to do with Pakistan, the role of the ISI. Where does Al-Qaeda fit into your portraits of the insurgency? Want to take a crack at either of those?
I think it's, to try to keep this short and simple, it's all the tensions between India and Pakistan are the core problem, and the Haqqanis and Al-Qaeda are taking advantage of them. I'm sure it's frustrated Pakistanis to no end that, Obama's visit and the support for the India and the UN Security Council. And it's not a simple thing either for the administration to kind of balance India's desire for a direct bilateral relationship. But there's just no question in my mind. When I covered the region, I toured the famous Indian consulate in Kandahar that was Pakistanis were absolutely convinced was that the Indians were seeding the clouds that would then cause rain and flooding down in Sindh. Pakistani military, and one last thought, the Pakistani military continues to see the region through the eyes of the Indian threat. And I know there's been tremendous amounts of energy put in to try to change that perception, but I think it's still true. So North Waziristan and keeping the Haqqanis as a proxy is all about India.
Sure. I don't think, in terms of looking at the Afghan insurgency, Al-Qaeda isn't a major factor. In particularly looking at the South, Al-Qaeda isn't there in any great numbers. In fact, even using the term Al-Qaeda is problematic. I mean, you have some foreigners who are there, Punjabis and some Pashtuns from Pakistan. They are, I think, by and large, marginal to the insurgency. If you look at the insurgency in Kandahar and Uruzgan and these places, it's driven and directed by Afghans for the most part, or almost entirely. Other parts of the country, for example, Kunduz, Nuristan, Kunar, there is a foreign fighter presence. In Kunduz, there are foreign fighters from the Stans in the north who come. But again, there's my understanding of it is that they have a secondary role. This is very different from 2001 and 2002, where in many ways Al-Qaeda was leading battles. And the Battle of Shahikot in 2002 was in many ways a fusion of Al-Qaeda and the Mansour Network, which is an Afghan insurgent group that were leading, trying to withstand a U.S. offensive there. And in those years, the Taliban looked to Al-Qaeda for some expertise, looked to Al-Qaeda for funding networks to the Gulf, etc. Today, the situation, if anything, is completely reversed, where the Taliban are completely self-sufficient in terms of funding, and if anything, Al-Qaeda looks to the Taliban for being able to operate within Afghanistan. If Al-Qaeda was done away with tomorrow, the Taliban and the insurgency, I think, would be just as strong.
Just two quick points, and again, I'll try to drill down from on the ground. We had a road construction crew, USAID funded road construction crew that was it was an Indian company, so just the visual of Sikhs driving along the Pakistani border, operating heavy equipment, it was guaranteed to be a bad meeting with our Pakistani counterparts whenever the road construction crew was out, so it was very much on their minds. I think we have to be careful in the Al-Qaeda question, and I've seen it both in reporting in my days in government and in the discourse of confusing Al-Qaeda with foreign fighters. My experience in the East, at least this time, there were a substantial number of foreign fighters, and working both with the Afghani network, and whether they were Al-Qaeda or not, or how they're, how you draw the line and block chart, I'm not sure, but they certainly were there, in the training camps that are literally ringing coast at this point. were pretty heavily populated and used. So my concern of the will Al-Qaeda return question goes down to an enforcement mechanism, and I would argue that if tens of thousands of coalition troops, a growing Afghan army, and a government can't necessarily enforce parts of its country, that if the Taliban does return in a meaningful way, either through negotiation or military means, even if they wanted to reject an Al-Qaeda influence, I'm not convinced that they could, and I think it's frankly a very dangerous assumption.
Do you want to get some questions? I know there was already some hands up. Yes, right there.
Landed with McClatchy newspapers. One area that the panel hasn't touched on at all is northern Afghanistan. And I just got back, and I want to particularly ask Anand this. The Taliban has expanded quite considerably up in the north. Going to Steve's point, that is perhaps the most successful economic area in Afghanistan. It's also strategic because of the new American logistics routes. One of the things that's happening up there now is that the Taliban have enfiladed those routes and can interdict them very, very, very easily. They're about 30 to 40 kilometers now from the northern end of the Salang Pass. Not in very large numbers, but nevertheless they've expanded. You can't drive to Mazar-e-Sharif anymore. Beyond that, there are now Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Gujars joining the Taliban in the north, not in very large numbers, but nevertheless the nervousness up there is significant. You've now had groups that have crossed the border into Tajikistan and staged an ambush of the Tajik army in September in the Rasht Valley. So I'm wondering, I guess, Anand, you might be able to put this in context, but anyone else. Last point up there, the former Jamiat commanders who fought for Ahmad Shah Massoud are all arming again, or have armed again. Their followers have armed again, being driven by national reconciliation. That mitigates against this idea that the Taliban can simply come back and take over the country, because what we're actually looking at is a major ethnic calamity, a new civil war, although fueled by the introduction of American weapons to the Afghan army, which would collapse in these circumstances. So I'm wondering if Anand, you could talk to that, and anyone else could talk to that as well.
Yeah, certainly the North, I think in many ways the Taliban views the North as one of its most important strategic objectives in the coming year. Mullah Zakir, who is one of the key Taliban military commanders, recently moved to Peshawar. The reason he did is to be able to better oversee the activities in the North. And what we've seen over the last few years in the North is very different than the South. The reasons I laid out for the Taliban's resurgence in the South, I think, don't entirely apply in the North. As you mentioned, I think in the North there is a degree of ethnic tensions at play in the North and in the West. For example, in Badghis province, where Balamurghab district, the Taliban's resurgence was fueled by Pashtun feelings of exclusion from the state of affairs. They felt that they were being oppressed by Tajik and Uzbek minorities. I think if you talk to Pashtuns in the north, in Baghlan and Kunduz, you have a similar dynamic. On top of that, the problem, as you mentioned also, is rearming old jihadi networks. So one of the most important commanders in Kunduz, he used to be, I think 2-3 years ago, he was selling fish in Hayartan, just running a shop, and now he's been rearmed. And whenever you arm somebody or rearm somebody in Afghan society, you have to deal with a whole host of issues going back 30, 40, 50 years. There was rivalries between mujahideen groups, rivalries coming from the Civil War time. I think all that's playing out now, and this is why we're seeing the North as one of the most violent parts of the country, in Kunduz in particular.
Does anyone else have anything?
Well, again, I think when you take the cumulative effect of discussions or misinterpretations, Jonathan, of July 11, discussions now, I think the new buzzword is transition, which many, the vast majority of Afghans that I talk to just kind of see as a fig leaf for withdrawal, reconciliation, grand bargains, Karzai's meetings with Pasha and Kiani instead of his natural counterpart, Zardari. So yeah, we dealt quite a bit with both the Tajiks and Hazaras and Ghazni, and they're petrified, frankly. And so are the various women's groups that we dealt with. Everyone's nervous, everyone's hedging, and frankly now in the North rearming.
More questions? Sure.
Hey, thanks. Hey, Dave Cook-Cullen. Anand, great paper. Or should I say, it tracks with what we're saying, so maybe we're both wrong. I liked your reference to Mohammadinejad in the paper, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you see the Taliban within the urban environment of Kandahar city, how they're operating, and how that differs from in the broader province, which is the rest of obviously the focus of your paper.
I think historically and traditionally there's been a rural-urban divide in the Taliban, where typically or traditionally the Taliban has appealed to rural sections of society, not urban sections. But what they've been able to do is to spread into areas like Mohammadinejad, which is a neighborhood in Kandahar. Mohammadinejad was actually a stronghold of the Mujahideen as well during the 80s. But they've been able to move into these areas, which I think is, in terms of the Taliban, is a unique development. There's not many other places in the country where you have urban areas that the Taliban are able to control. It's typically rural areas. Even in the rural areas, the district centers, which are very roughly urban, even though there may be one or two cross streets, are controlled by the government, and outside of that, the Taliban are able to control. Part of that, I think, has to do with the experience of the 80s, in which there has been a strong sentiment for the Mujahideen and strong sentiment in terms of resisting foreign forces in places like Mohammadinejad. Also, if you go to Mohammadinejad, it doesn't really look like a city. It's more urban, it's more rural than you would expect, even though properly speaking, it's part of Kandahar city. And you have walled houses, and you have the houses are a bit spread out. And so I think it has there's an extent to which it is not completely urbanized, and the Taliban have been able to move into that area partly because of that.
Okay, I want to get someone in the back there.
Hey, Jeff Bressler from the Institute for the Study of War. Kuram and the bill of Haqqani relocation to Kuram, whether permanently or just in part. What do you think about that, Anand? And then I guess Mike, this type of infrastructure that we have set up on the other side of the border in that area to be successful, interdicting rat lines, etc.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the whole question. You're asking about the Haqqanis in Kuram, is that right? Yes?
Sorry.
Okay. Well, I think Kuram's interesting. The Haqqanis have been involved in trying to mediate the sectarian conflict in Kuram, particularly in Parachinar, where there are Shia tribes and Sunni tribes. And I don't know the full story about this, but it was explained to me by one Haqqani commander that one of the reasons is because that area is a very important transit corridor for the Haqqanis from Pakistan to Afghanistan and vice versa. And the sectarian strife in that area was actually causing problems for their ability to move things around or move their people around. And so there's at least 2 meetings that I know of in the last year in which Haqqani representatives went to Kuram to try to bring the various sides, the Turi tribe, who are mostly Shia, and then other groups at the table to try to get them to come to some sort of agreement and focus not on fighting each other, but fighting the Americans in Afghanistan.
I could speak a bit about the Kuram problem, and I don't have much more to add beyond Anand, except that he's absolutely right. The Turi, which are a Shia tribe, or a cross-border tribe, were increasingly viewed as ascendant by the Haqqanis, and therefore a problem. And significant pressure was put on the Turi because they're cross-border. They were able to block and even shut down some of the Haqqanis' border access. And the area they cared most about was a place called Jaji, which if you've kind of a student of the Mujahideen in the 80s, was where Osama bin Laden and others really set up a bunch of their cave networks. So bottom line, I think it's a fascinating but disturbing sectarian issue. We worked quite a bit with the Turi. I can't get into it beyond there, except that I would encourage anybody to look at the problems around Parachinar. The Shia there have typically held kind of the best land, some of the best positions in the Haqqani, and frankly, to some extent, elements of Pakmil and others were putting significant pressure on that tribe, or at least at a minimum to cut a deal to allow kind of unfettered border access.
Bob Hathaway at the Wilson Center. If you'll allow me a historical question, because I think it helps to understand how we got to this current situation in order to figure out where to go next. I'd like each of the three of you, or four of you, if you care, Susan, where do we go wrong? We went in 2001. None of us ever dreamed that 9 years later we would still be there. By most measures, things are worse there than they were 9 years ago. What were really the key mistakes using the advantage of 9 years of experience?
That's an easy question. Phil, I think you have all the answers.
Not giving more money to the CIA was a big problem. That's right. Let me make one comment, and it's far more global than South Asia. I always think about the Marshall Plan, and two questions come to mind. The first is soft power in my mind is hard power. You go in big and you invest heavy, and what you want to do over time after that, you want to create an environment globally where people say, look at what they did, whether it's the Marshall Plan or Afghanistan. We can't help but stand behind the Americans. And so I think going in bigger, not necessarily, I don't know, I'm not a military expert, but think of this in global terms. How do we catapult from this event into a return of the perception of the United States that was in the 1950s? And I think we had an historic opportunity to dump huge amounts of money in. I think the American people would have struggled to understand why we're paying so much, because the context for me would have been entirely global and not local. And the second sub-piece of that is, and it's reflecting some of the conversation here today, is to ensure that if we believe our mission is eliminating the prospect of civil war as opposed to eliminating the prospect of safe haven for a terrorist group, that we are very conscious about making that leap, because that has implications for military presence, for economic development, for the length of time we intend to stay, for expectations management. Clearly in this country, I think partly because of the investment, the sunken investment in Afghanistan, we've transitioned long ago from talking about the risk to Twin Towers in New York to the risk of Karzai toppling because we leave and the return of civil war. Very different mission.
We'll go right to left. I think that's part of the problem, frankly, Bob, is that no one ever dreamed we'd be there that long. I have to tell you, some did and pushed hard for us to make that investment right up front. But when you're looking at the fourth poorest country of the world, recently ranked as the second most corrupt, 75% illiteracy rate, no infrastructure to speak of, no means of kind of national income, devastated civil society, highly dispersed population, or really forbidding terrain. I think the more and the sooner that we made that investment, but we didn't, the better we would have been in the long term. And again, I am convinced that that stabilizing Afghanistan does directly relate to preventing Al-Qaeda's return. And again, the longer we let this kind of incrementally drag out without making that investment, I think the worse we're going to be in the long run. And God forbid should we have to actually leave in some meaningful way that's not advantageous to our national security interests and then try to go back and win the trust and support of the Afghan people. that idea, frankly, petrifies me.
Well, we would be here for a few weeks, I think, if we were going to talk about what we did wrong.
Yeah.
But one thing, and this is just one of many things that I'd like to draw attention to, is what I spoke about in my talk, which was the failure of reconciliation in the early years. The terms that we, or Washington, or the Afghan government is offering today is an honorable surrender. Accept the Afghan constitution, give up your weapons, and we'll give you amnesty. But that doesn't fly today because the Taliban are doing quite well, right? That should have been offered in 2001 and 2002 when the Taliban were a defeated, spent force, and they would have been amenable to that sort of thing. So I think it's a major thing that we've done wrong.
I don't want to prolong the panel too much, but I think I would just leave it with the failure to understand the history of the place that we were going into back in 2001 and 2002, which sort of is an umbrella thing that captures that. I'm thinking of David's book idea where he was going to write the book about Helmand Province, and thinking what became of those bungalows in Little America in Lashkar, which I visited in early 2002, and there was a complete. The Afghans remembered the American presence there, but the Americans didn't remember what had gone on there, and I think the same thing. You couldn't help but think about our incredible ignorance of history when you looked at the tunnel, which I gather from Jonathan is no longer safe to take to Mazar-i-Sharif, that the Soviets had built as part of their competition with the U.S. for favor in Afghanistan in the 50s and 60s, and look in those half-collapsed galleries leading up the mountain where they had been fought over for the last 2 decades and are now being fought over again. And I think that sort of going without any real clue as to what you're doing into a country that is the 4th poorest in the world, and not really having a clear sense of what you hope to get out of that mission, and then extending it year after year while your focus was elsewhere. Sure, we can have a lot of conferences, but I think we all probably have a pretty clear sense that it went wrong from the very beginning in that sense. Should we sneak in one more question, I think, before moving on to the next panel? Do we have one more question? Okay, well, we'll take a coffee break then, I guess, and be back. Thank you very much.